Welcome, everybody. I'd love to introduce John Battles from UC Berkeley, who's been looking at the evolution of forests, the various disruptions and the recoveries of forests at a large scale. Welcome, John.
Great, thank you. Well, I appreciate the invite. It's certainly it's a sort of a fun audience to try and prepare a talk for. As you'll find out, all of my research has been very place-based. I'm a field ecologist, very empirical. Oops, sorry, let me get something going. Very empirical. But part of this is going to go from the empirical part and give a really kind of a good case study to demonstrate the power of the kind of research I do. But then how do you go beyond the place? And that really gets into the second part of the talk of how you make what I consider, get big insights from these small place-based data. Again, so I study forests. Forests are valued resources. They provide natural solutions in our arenas of conflict. A friend of mine, a running buddy of mine, is an environmental historian. He got very excited about the role of the big tall white pines in New England back in the colonial period, and that cutting off England's access off to these tall ship masts was really played a big role in both, certainly in the Revolutionary War, but more importantly, the War of 1812 was largely about access to resources. And so trees have always been valued. They're valuable resources. They're also more recently, in a recent Paris Agreement, we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and forests are a key part of what they call sort of nature-based solutions. And of course, forests, because they're resources, have always been arenas of conflict. The multiple uses don't always play nice together. And indeed, in sort of the earliest written human text in the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of his earlier exploits was heading to the Lebanon cedars and defeating the protector, the Hamaba, who's displayed in that picture on the lower right. And then he killed the Hamaba, cut down all the forests, and made them into spears. So it's always been arenas of conflict. So the modern wrinkle, though, is that we consider forests as a hazard. They are major hazards. They're major costs to society. And California is probably arguably at the epicenter of that hazard. On the right here, I'm showing the black is the footprint of forests in California, and the colored red are the places where there is a high to very high wildfire hazard potential. These are the places where you get these catastrophic forests that we've been seeing in California. The 2021 Dixie Fire up in Plumas County burned over 1 million acres, and that is extraordinary. And they really are an existential threat to the future of forests, pretty much in all Mediterranean climates going forward. So here's a specific example that's kind of near and dear to my heart. This is the 2022 mosquito fire. So 2022 wasn't a bad fire year in California. We're in El Dorado County. The relevance of this site is that right down here, the laser pointer here, and the bottom of this fire right here is Blodgett Research Forest, which is the University of California's research forest that I've been working at my whole career here. And you can see that finally this 2022 fire burned sort of the northern part of our research forest. You can see it was just inevitable. We barely missed this huge fire in 2014. The fire came right up to the edge of Blodgett property, and then the wind shifted, and Blodgett didn't burn down. And right before that, the year before, we had the 2013 American fire that again we thought might come down through this high wildfire hazard landscape and get into Blodgett Forest. But it didn't either. But 2022, it finally did. It burned in here. So the issue here is that Blodgett Forest is also the place where I would say there's, what I'm going to talk about today, there's really been a landmark study started 20 years ago where we looked, how do we prevent these high severity wildfires? Again, the goal in California, we're a fire-prone ecosystem, is not to eliminate fire, it's to prevent the high severity fire and then have low to moderate intensity fire that's much more easily managed, much less destructive, and we can live with that kind of fire. So that's really what we've been doing at Blodgett Forest. We've run a 20-year, sort of replicated before-after control impact design to try and see what mechanisms, what kind of treatments between prescribed fire, mechanical treatments, mechanical plus fire might reduce the fire risk, the wildfire hazard, as well as maintaining other benefits to this forest. So here's an outline of Blodgett Forest. It's in El Dorado County, near Georgetown, California. We had these replicated sites across this 4,000-acre footprint, and the mosquito fire burnt in this northern half. And this plot right here is our control plot, and we lost that. That burned at pretty high severity. But then the fire encountered this thinning, this fire treatment right here, and it really slowed it down. And at the same time, we had a lot of CAL FIRE resources who were making a stand at Blodgett, and we were able to put the mosquito fire out. And so we really limited, because of this history of treatments and again, good suppression work from CAL FIRE, we were able to sort of save most of the forest. The part that it did get, the mosquito fire impacts, this is a picture of Dr. Rob York, who is the co-director of the Berkeley Forest, and he's a specialist, does all his, he works on fire and silviculture. And so this is in the aftermath of our control plot, in the untreated control. 84% of the trees died. We had about a 50% loss in sort of biomass or base layer reduction, and it created a lot of PM 2.5 emissions. These are the criteria pollutants that makes smoke so hazardous. And again, all of the leading research, the more research we see on the impacts of smoke on human health, it just gets worse and worse. So basically, I always think the only healthy amount of smoke is no smoke. And of course, it also combusted all the fuels, all the fine fuels, all the duff, all the shrubs and herbs. So it really did have a big impact on it. So this study that I want to talk about, this is a 20-year study. We've been doing it since 2001. It's experimental designs before, after impact control. So it's a very rigorous experimental design. We had 3 replicates of 3 different treatments, the fire and then surrogates to fire. So mechanical treatments where we remove mainly merchantable trees and some small trees. We have mechanical plus fire, and then we have fire only. And of course, we also have 3 controls. And recently, because of the mosquito fire, we had to replace one. These are pretty small units, 40 to 60 acres, and we concentrate our research sort of in the middle of these fires so we avoid edge effects. And at the beginning, really one of the real powerful parts of this study is that all the experimental units were pretty much similar before we started treating them. What I'm going to do is take you quickly through a series of slides that describes what we've been doing on this forest for the last 20 years. One of the unique parts of this fire and fire surrogate study at Blodgett is that it started off in 2001 as a national study where there were sites all over the fire-prone areas of the United States. There's a couple in California, there's a lot in the Southeast, or all across the Rockies, Washington and Oregon. And so it was an organized study for that first bit. The key part, what Blodgett kept doing is that beyond the initial study, beyond the initial 5 years, that Blodgett has maintained these treatments, and then again has repeatedly not just done one treatment, but tried to literally restore fire or a surrogate of fire on the landscape and understand what the impacts of that is. So this is the beginning. This is what the forest looked like before treatment, and this is in the fire treatment. And I have this big watch sign here that kind of orients you to these different photos so you can see what happens to the tree. So this picture right here is this is what a high hazard forest looks like in the Sierra Nevada. There's some big trees there, but you can see a lot of little trees. You can see the canopy, sort of there's a way, we call them ladder fuels, for a fire that starts on the ground to get up into the canopy. You look on the ground there and you see lots of small branches and twigs and a lot of litter. There is a lot of combustible material in nearly all the different classes here. So this is a pre-treatment year -1, post-year -1. We go and put a fire there. This fire in 2002 was a pretty intense for a prescribed fire. It burned pretty hot. I mean, I was the director of Berkeley Forest at the time, and I was pretty worried about this. It would not have been good for me if they burned down Blodgett Forest, but it didn't. They controlled the fire, and we had this burn. So this is the year right after the fire. So it's post year 1 after the fire, and you can see a lot of that material is gone. All the branches on the ground is gone. There's a fair bit. There's really some good work going on here, and really reducing the wildfire hazard of this. So, we did burn some overstory trees. You can see the stumps here, and here. But in general, it was a really good burn. It was a really productive burn. It really lowered the wildfire hazard.
So question,
yes.
What we just saw, which looked pretty intense, was a control burn, right?
Yes, that's at the high end of it, though. High end. They don't usually burn that hot. So.
I see. Okay, so but normally you do get a pretty significant. I mean, there's a pretty huge thinning there, even for a pretty controlled burn, right? Yeah.
But that was, again, Scott Stevens was the lead on this. He's a fire scientist and is a very skilled burner. And so that was one of the values of the experimental forest, because he had difficulty going and doing just a prescribed fire without any pre-treatment in the national forest. Mm-hmm. But my reasoning and the one I argued to the dean of our college when I approved it was that this is what our experimental forests are for.
Yes.
We need to be able to do really meaningful experiments. And there's some risk to that. And if the university is not going to take the risk of getting you knowledge, who is? And so that's you'll see some other burns in a minute that show much more moderated burns. So this is post year 1. By year 7, and this was a little bit of surprise, we had accumulated a fair bit of fuel. Some of the trees that had got damaged when the fire had come down, so we have these heavy logs here. You can see, there's abundant. We opened up the canopy, and you can see this abundance of shrubs. These shrubs can burn pretty hot, and they're a pretty consistent layer of fuels. And so again, we decided to go back in there and burn them again. And you can see here's a big difference here, Greg, in that this is the second burn in 2009. It's 9 years into the experiment. It's our second burn. And you can see a much more moderated, low intensity burn. For scale here, you can see one of the firefighters up there sort of monitoring this burn going forward. But we really wanted to reduce these shrub fuels, and again, this accumulated surface fuels on the ground. Here's the post. Again, this is really looking nice now. You can see, again, a lot of that shrub mass is gone. A lot of the litter and stuff on the ground is gone. But you can also see all this black, all this char on these live trees here. That does damage the trees. It does have an impact on how they perform going forward. But again, that's kind of the trade-off you have with prescribed fires. Here's this is post 17. This is year 17. This is 8 years post the second fire. Again, you can see we're accumulating some of these fuels, these heavy fuels on the ground. Again, we can see the shrubs coming back here and here. And so we did a third burn. We did a third burn post 8. Again, here's the third burn. Again, a much more moderated burn, very targeted burn to try and, again, get these shrubs out of the way and again, reduce the fuels. So here's what it looked like in, post 1 year after that third burn. It's year 18 of the study. Again, you can see we removed a lot of those surface fuels. Again, every time we do it, we're removing carbon, but we're also removing the wildfire hazard. And again, here it is 4 years later. Here it is today, roughly in 2021. We are again getting worried about this accumulation. And so this is the most recent burn, which I'm not going to show you results on it, but we just completed this burn last year. So this is the 4th entry. And in many ways, this is what we think we need to do to maintain, to kind of get a handle on the wildfire crisis. It's not a one and done. We need to have repeated. These are perhaps a bit more, once we get these established, we can probably back off the frequency, but we really want to understand the role here. Of course, we had other treatments. Again, these are yes.
What's the fire frequency like before we started doing firefighting on these forests? What was the frequency of fires back then?
Yeah, so right there, so our historical fire record at Blodgett, and that's why we justify some of these short intervals. It would vary. It would vary between 4 and 15 years. Again, that and one reason why we did that third burn is that if you remember, we had the 2012-2015 drought. And we expect that, that causes a lot of mortality, a lot of litter to come on the ground. So we assume that historically that lower end of that burn interval probably was during dry years, and then during wetter years it would extend. So we're well within the natural, the sort of the pre-European burn cycle that indigenous stewardship would typically do in Sierra Nevada.
Cool. And so you showed pictures of the vegetation. What happens in the animal life?
Yeah, that was the initial part of this. This does not seem to be very negative. I mean, in a lot of ways, it's hard to look at how the birds are probably the ones that are the most important. It's hard to measure those on these small stands, but in terms of ground mammals, there was very little impact. And if there were impacts, it's ephemeral. The biggest risk, though, of course, is the spotted owl, which use these, this is spotted owl territory, these dense overgrown forests with big trees. And again, it seems to be, yes, this is one of the trade-offs. There is a sort of decrease in their population because we're removing sort of rare nesting sites. And so that's one of the trade-offs is it is a small decrease in owl habitat. And that's probably the biggest concern.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, and then you can't put fire everywhere. I mean, there's huge downsides to fire, the emissions in particular. When you do a prescribed fire and if it reduces the amount of emissions created during a wildfire, that's a net benefit for the population of California. But when you do prescribed fires, the local communities are getting that smoke. And so there are some environmental justice issues, some fairness issues about that. And there's also places where you just can't get fire or it's too dangerous to put fire. And so another approach is to use, mechanical treatments where you go in there and it's really a two-step. You go in there and first you thin the middle-sized trees, maybe a couple of the canopy trees. They can be merchantable size, so you can get some timber value from them. And then, so here's what it looks like before in year 0. You thin the trees, you go in there, you use a masticator, because once you thin the trees, you go and chop everything up and leave it on the ground. And so this is what it looks like post year 1 and a mechanical treatment. It certainly opened it up, but one of the risks is that you can see a lot of debris on the ground and shredded material on the ground. So that fuel bed is pretty dangerous. It would be hard to get up into the canopy. You have a big, deep fuel bed, but there's no intermediate tree. That's what the thinning does. And so for the first couple of years after a mechanical treatment, there's a very high risk if a fire starts there. Again, we think the annual burn probability, the probability of this catching on fire any given year is 1%. And so you are running a risk for a few years. But after 8 years, you have that all that woody debris starts decomposing, and you should really get a forest that again looks like this. One of the when we're out on field trips, if you can see through a forest, you can kind of see and kind of jog through a forest without having to move around very much. That's sort of at the right spacing to really reduce the wildfire hazard going forward. So that's kind of the introduction to it. Kind of give you an idea of what we did. We completed these. And then in 2020, we did a series of pair of two papers, 2 synthesis papers that looked at the impacts of this long-term experiment. And the first synthesis that Scott Stevens, who's my colleague, led, really focused on this combination. What did it do to wildfire mitigation in forests? How these 3 different treatment combinations, and each one of these treatment combinations has pros and cons. And so the idea here that there were different pathways for achieving success in the Sierra Nevada, and really this idea that you have to keep doing it. The sustainability is really an important part. The second synthesis that I want to talk about today was adding in the carbon cost of wildfire mitigation. There is a carbon cost to wildfire mitigation. It's a really important topic because you are removing carbon from the forest. You are creating emissions. And again, we expect, as I noted, we expect our forest to do, again, a lot of services. And one of those is to store carbon and remove it from the atmosphere and mitigate the impacts of climate change. And so this graph here kind of shows what the, and also it was also a basic question in forest ecology. What was the carbon balance when you do controls and fuel treatments? Because when you reduce fuel treatments, you're definitely thinning the canopy. You might get faster regrowth. And so this is kind of the idea that we want to know, is that you start up here in this, and we assume that the 2 control sites and the treated sites are the same 5 years before treatment. They're kind of tracking each other. All of these forests are grading since they're clear cut at the turn of the century, and there's been no fires, so they're just kind of growing back. And then we have this treatment effect at year 0. The control keeps going. It begins to slow down over the 20 years. And the idea is, what does this recovery period look like in terms of the carbon stored in the treated states? Because this is really important. Because this difference right here from what the controls are doing to what the treatments are after 20 years is the carbon cost. And this really was kind of the conceptualization and framework that PhD student here at UC Berkeley, Yihang Zhu, did. And she's a lead author on this study that's in press at Ecological Applications. And this model all assumes no wildfire. And really, the question is, does this ever get, does the treatment site ever recover? Is it permanent? What is the net ecosystem carbon balance of these treatments? And really, what is this carbon cost? Because these really are, you can sell these. This is what you sell in offset markets. These are important for calculating global carbon emissions. And so it's an important aspect of what goes on here.
So this actually is a big one because fire is the real reason, because now you have a probabilistic, the thing on top is very probabilistic, high variance, things below
Yes.
much lower variance. How do you relate those?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, so that's the big question. So you have to, that is what every manager, every policymaker has to decide. Like, what is the risk of me getting a fire here, right? Because this is assuming no fire. And again, when there's no fire, control is the obvious winner. And this is really what we'll show in this. I'm going to get to that question in the study, that we track through time, and then in the year 20, we model a wildfire and see what happens. So we're going to
Excellent.
So just, and again, one of the main values of this study is that aside from the modeled wildfire at the very end, all of this data is empirical. It's all measured. It's been measured every year. We're doing the synopsis. Almost all of the major carbon pools have been tracked. There's no extrapolation. There's no modeling. It's really pretty a big, straightforward sort of empirical measurement. And in terms of total, you're going to see a series of slides like this where I have the 4 treatments on the x-axis: control, fire, mechanical treatment, mechanical plus fire. In this case, total measured carbon on the y-axis. And I'm going to show the distribution and then the effect size going forward. And so right here is pretty clear that there's a huge increase in control. Fire and mech are pretty much same. They get back to where they were over the 20 years, and then mech plus fire actually has a net loss of stored carbon. And then effect sizes show this, and this is one of the values of this rigorous Baki design, is that you really do have a lot of power. So you can see a huge increase. This is a control, so they gained carbon, and then all the 3 treatments lost carbon. Big effect sizes, 2 to 3 megagrams per hectare compared to the controls. So there's a big difference here, certainly in the total stored carbon. So there is obviously a carbon cost to these treatments. But again, we've gotten to think about, carbon is a resource. Carbon is a resource. It's a resource that fuels the productivity. It fuels all of the ecology in a forest. It provides the energy for the consumers, for the food webs, and so it can either get burned up in a fire, it's a resource, or it can get consumed. It's that risk from, and I've on the y-axis here, I have fire hazard, kind of a gradient from active crown fire, which is a real, really severe, intense fire, to a low severity fire, to fire not being able to even be started there. But you could take wildfire hazard out and take drought, or put drought in there, or put bark beetle attacks, or anything that would lead to sort of the killing biomass. Intense, and the more you have, oftentimes, the more there's likely to lose. But we think that this is kind of like the idea that we think like, here's the fire hazard. It increases in this sort of logistic fashion through time. But there's a point here somewhere in the middle where, and this is kind of the sweet spot that we're thinking about in California, where we're willing to tolerate moderate risk, but we also do, and it's really important to, especially in California, to meet our greenhouse gas reduction goals, not to be putting enormous amounts of emissions into the atmosphere. And so I think about, and this might be kind of even if a fire came, you would have a fair bit of some resiliency to that fire. So we kind of call it sort of, what is the stable carbon? Given the resources available, the light, the nutrients, without a fire, you could carry a lot more, and that's what we're seeing right now, this carrying capacity. But what is this sort of, what carbon storage can we get where it could be stable? So how do we define stable carbon? Well, that's basically carbon in pools in certain structures that are more resistant to fire. And in a forest, there's 3 of them. There's sort of big trees, because they have more resistance. There's certain species of trees, and then probably the biggest resistant pool is soil mineral carbon. Carbon in the soil that is not, in the bottom of the soil, that is not amenable to changing. Again, this is the same thing, the 4 treatments, and this is a large tree. We think trees bigger than 76 centimeters in diameter, sort of around, in width, tend to be more fire resistant. Their canopies are higher, they have thicker bark, they're more insulated. And it seems like all of the trees, all of the sites seem to get a bit more carbon, a bit more, higher percentage of bigger trees. And that's kind of what the effect sizes show. Clearly the mechanical and mechanical fire grew the most, but even the control had a significant, sort of increase in the number of big trees. So the carbon, there is some stable carbon increasing over time. Trees are just growing bigger. This is a very productive forest. The other one is, again, what fraction of these trees are in fire-resistant species? And in this case, it's the 2 pine species, sugar pine and ponderosa pine. These are species that, again, they hold their canopies higher up away from the ground. They have very thick bark. So it's really the heat that kills the trees. So they have very thick bark, and because they self-prune their branches so much, a fire is not able to carry up there until it starts killing sort of the living tissue, the leaves up there. And here we saw a really big effect only in the mechanical treatment, where in some ways, in the mechanical plus fire, one, it was that, we were removing, when you remove trees, you're removing, the most abundant trees, you're removing some of these understory trees. But again, the fire, and this is the place where we had a really hot fire, really seemed to favor the pines over the other trees. So you get this huge effect of stable carbon going forward. Of course, the big question that Greg raised earlier is, okay, so this is without a fire. This is without wildfire. We haven't had a wildfire Blodgett, certainly within this study, until the mosquito fire, but that was after this study. What happens with wildfire? Do you shift around these carbon costs, where if with a wildfire, does the fuel treatment again end up being the winner in terms of avoided costs, to be, these sort of the economic term we talk about. So it's really a big question of what this looks like. And so to do that, we again used a wildfire model. Fortunately, we had a really good sort of recent fire to be able to parameterize this model. This is the only model we have in this entire paper, but we knew what the mosquito fire did. We knew what the weather was like. We knew what the winds were like. And so we were able to really carefully model a wildfire. And in fact, we tried to get the responses we saw in the mosquito fire. When we do that, so this is modeled wildfire effects, we look at the control versus all the three other treatments. And in every other category you care about, wildfire emissions, percent mortality, percent large dead trees. So basically emissions, tree mortality, and stable carbon, the control was 2 to 3 times worse than any of the treatments. It lost, 2 or 3 times more wildfire emissions. The mortality was 3 or 4 times higher, and a lot of the you killed a lot of large dead trees in this system. But the key part overall, the carbon cost, even with a fire, was still more from controls. So this is kind of what we call our trade-off document, and this is with wildfire. And it's a little bit of these radar graphs can be a little bit confusing to read, but I like them because they kind of pull together these two studies and say, what did we learn? And so, we have, again, the original study, we're really focused on wildfire hazard, fire hazard, and forest health, right? And so you can see the way to read these is to go here on the edge. These are all, if you're on the edge, that's the best, the best outcome. You really lowered wildfire hazard. And so that's, the red is the MEC plus fire. The next one is the MEC in terms of reducing wildfire hazard. The next one is fire. And they're always like this kind of cluster where MEC plus fire reduces it the most. Fire and MEC alone are kind of in the middle. And then at the bottom here in the middle, this is the worst. This is the control in the middle. And so that axis there. For forest health and stable carbon, you can see these patterns stay the same. And it's always the MEC plus fire that's the winner on that. Of course, you go to this other step, when you look at, if you care about carbon benefit, you get this very opposite response. So here's the carbon benefit. And even with a wildfire, the carbon cost or the carbon benefit is greatest for the control. And then you get MEC and fire again being together. And the worst is MEC plus fire. There's a third axis though, and this gets back to, I think, a point about sustainability. Since 2021, the federal government and state of California has spent over $7 billion on fuel retreatments and wildfire mitigation. That is not nearly enough to get a handle on the wildfire crisis. Also, it's not just a one and done. We need to be able to find ways of sustaining that. So the economic benefit or the economic costs to putting these treatments in there is a big part of it. And again, this is where you see the MEC really shining, because an economic benefit, you actually make money on the MEC because you took out commercial saw timber and sold it, right? And so that's clearly the highest benefit. MEC plus fire is in the middle because you don't get as much merchantable timber from that. In the middle, the control is right here in the middle, and then the absolute worst is fire, because some of those big trees you just killed, and so and also it costs money to put them, prescribed fire. We think about $2,000 an acre to do a prescribed fire. So this is kind of the way we talk about trade-offs. It's interesting. I think it's really important for policymakers and managers to kind of balance it and have this quantitative information to figure out what are the relative benefits to these different treatments.
So question on
yes.
this. How are you relating carbon benefit and stable carbon? Because
that's
stability is part of the carbon benefit.
Yeah, so stable carbon is just, if you really care about this, resilient carbon is probably the stable carbon. If you just care about how much carbon you are now storing in this forest that's reducing, that's offsetting greenhouse gas emissions, that's carbon benefit. It's just the inverse of carbon costs.
But let's say if I want to just have the total amount of carbon per time for the coming century, which is a combination of carbon benefit and stable carbon, how do they combine? Because now it goes up, down, up, down, up, down.
Yeah. So that would be, again, this is where you have to know what the annual probability of fire is.
Yes.
And I think that's the key. You can make, depending on what you put, if you put it in there 1%, you get one answer. If you put it in there 2%, you start shifting the higher probability of fire, the more you shift toward the mech plus fire type treatments, the more intensive treatments, and it kind of depends on what you think about that. So this is just again, you're right. This is analysis where there's 20 years of treatments without any wildfire, and then wildfire comes in year 20, and this is the accounting after, if you get, so that's, if you think about it, that's one wildfire in 20 years. That's way lower than 1%. I mean, that's way higher than 1%, right? That's 5%. So this, so that's, and those are the, and you can, but the other part, if you want to run if you want to go and game this thing, if you want to go and model it out, this is exactly the kind of input you would want to need to be able to make those kind of decisions.
Right. Got it.
An interesting part, and just kind of, this is more from the ecological side, is that what we're showing is that we had 3 fires going in here. And one of the concerns is that, what is the fire effect on the ecosystem? And you can see in this first year, that really hot burn, that this is growth rate. The x-axis here is growth. How fast is the forest growing after the treatment? And you can see that the fire was growing less in sort of, than the green, which is the control, right? So, the fire's here, the control's over here. So the control is growing faster. After that second recovery period, they're growing at about the same time. And interesting, by the time we got to the third fire recovery period, we have the fire treatment being more productive than the control, which is really interesting. And again, if this continues, then there's going to be this added benefit. If we maintain fire on the landscape, that is it continuing to, it's reducing, every time you burn it, you're adding nutrients to the system, the forest is growing faster. Every time you burn it, you're probably killing pests and you're killing pathogens in the soil. There's a lot of added benefit besides just thinning the trees from fire that the other treatments don't have. And it really does seem that, most of the studies are 1 or 2 fires, but repeated fire on the landscape might have this long-term productivity benefit that might change the entire trajectory of everything I just showed. The other interesting part is that we're also looking at what is the rate of accumulation of surface fuels. These are the ones that really sort of drive fire risk and fire behavior. So this is a similar study, a similar graph. Again, surface fuel accumulation and recovery rate is on the x-axis, and then sort of the probability densities on the y. Again, the first fuel recovery, those fuels in the fires grew back really fast. That's why we had to burn it. You saw all that fuel accumulation. In that second fire recovery period, the 2 are alike. And that after the third recovery period, the fire is recovering slower than the control. So we've totally reversed that. So these are really interesting, is that not only is the fire restored landscape growing faster, it's not accumulating a lot of surface fuels. The surface fuels are dead branches, dead leaves, detritus, debris. And so again, we're really in some ways getting a more productive forest that's not producing as much surface fuel accumulation. So we might be able to lengthen these fires out longer in the future, and therefore reduce the costs and reduce the risk. All right, so the next step. So this is a long-term experiment, started in 2001. We had a fire in 2019, 2016, and then we just put in this 2024 study. The point here is that this was not designed this way. This initial study was designed by Scott Stevens. This is a picture of Scott Stevens right here. And then 2009, it shifted to where this, we maintained it because it's an experimental forest. So, we maintained the site. But then in 2009, we really did that. 2009 burn was really about concerns about carbon accumulation and carbon storage. The 2016, this is what I really sort of got heavily involved in this site, is that we were really more interested in drought response. And again, how do these treatments affect drought responses? How does the treatment interaction and drought and tree mortality and fire all interact? And so we're trying to understand what's going on, but it's been this, in some ways, an ad hoc sort of consortium of work going forward to maintain what ends up being a 25-year inventory. And in synopsis, that is what I do. That is the kind of research I've done. The other site I've spent a lot of my time is over in New England. It's a Hubbard Brook ecosystem study. This is the longest forest experimental study in the United States. It began right back here in 1965, taking forest inventories, looking at environmental and disturbance effects on the ecosystem there. This is the record of, every one of these little dots is an inventory of an entire watershed. And it's 60 years long. And I came in here in about 2002 and took it over. So for the last 20 years, I've been responsible for maintaining this long-term sort of inventory site going forward. And these two examples of Blodgett Forest and Hubbard Brook have really shaped my thinking going forward. I think I saw this editorial that forests are a life support system, and we should be more serious about taking their pulse. I totally agree. You see this all the time, and we need to really get serious about it going forward. My whole career has spent really at this place-based research. I study trees. I'm an empiricist, and so that means I'm invested in these places for the long term. But every time I do a study, and a lot of my studies have been either at Hubbard Brook or at Blodgett, even though I have internal replication, it's still one site. It's one site. It's a place-based thing. And of course, what goes on at Blodgett is not even representative of what goes on in all of Sierra Nevada. What goes on at Hubbard Brook in New Hampshire is not representative of what goes on in the entire White Mountains. But there's a lot of these kind of individual place-based inventories out there. And they're all tend to be idiosyncratic. They're all designed for a particular study how do we make that, putting them all together, easier? All right, so the two premises to what we're thinking about here is clearly forests are degrading worldwide, and though we have huge advances in remote sensing and monitoring, still for some of the metrics we care about, the only way to acquire them is getting into the woods, going in there in the woods and measuring sort of responses that can't be detected yet with surveillance, sort of remote sensing or aerial surveillance. And clearly, if you look at the literature, one of the suggestions is that the solutions require more data. We need more data. We need more of the more data out there to understand what's going on. There's two barriers to more data. It's limited given the costs of forest inventories. I mean, these are again in the grand scheme of things in terms of typical they take labor costs. They're relatively simple labor costs, but they still take time. And I think equally importantly, there's no incentives and potentially disincentives for individual researchers and individual forest managers to share. So that first barrier, I think, this is the way we did it. This is a picture of how basically I've been doing my research for the last 60 years. At Hubbard Brook, Tom Sikkema did the first 40 years. I took over, as I mentioned, 20 years ago. And this is what we do. We literally go out there and identify trees, measure their diameter. When we're doing fuel inventories, we're literally counting sticks, by size class. And the idea is that you basically hand this off through the generations through long-term data, then you recruit. And I'm in the position right now in my career where I'm trying to recruit the next generation of sort of forest monitoring and inventory at Hubbard Brook. We need to make that transition soon. It's not going to be this kid, but we need to figure out how that goes on. And how do we do that? And it's been very ad hoc. How do we institutionalize it so when we hand it off, it's a replicable, sort of smooth process? And of course, the cost of inventories are also going down. These techniques, terrestrial laser scanning to detect change. I think this is I'm totally vested in this. We're getting good enough with it. This is just no longer a research project. It's part of the regular monitoring going on. You have terrestrial LiDAR. You have individual LiDAR. You can do a lot of things with just a LiDAR on the back of your iPhone these days. That really allows you to collect more data. So I don't think it's going to be collecting more data. At least there's still costs involved in that. But the technology is helping us do this thing a lot faster. I think the bigger problem is the idea of sharing data, and then also more importantly, sharing processes to analyze that data. So, and it really comes down to trust. So there's a lot for empiricists like myself, and a lot of these people on these papers are colleagues of mine. Gene Likens was the founder of Hubbard Brook. We're totally vested in Hubbard Brook ecosystem study. Everything I do there, I produce and share all my data within 1 year, within at most 2 years of collecting it. It's totally open. It's out there. It's for people to use. It's a huge investment. I'm totally vested in providing good databases. The problem is that there's a lack of investment in inventories, and that it's seen as monitoring. It's seen like NSF doesn't invest in. It's hard to get it funded unless you're asking a cutting edge question. Clearly the federal government is disinvesting in it systematically for the last 20, 30 years with abrupt change right now. So that's one of them. Is that there's this idea that all of this work is not invested in. There's not an investment. We struggle for it. Everybody values it, but there's nothing to invest in it. And then what, a data scientist comes in, a synthesis study comes in, sucks up all this data, then has a Nature or Science paper, then goes get a job at Princeton or one of the elite universities. While the inventory and monitoring person is gets an acknowledgement. The other one, and I think more important for me, is that there's also just a distrust of how domain inexperts take this data and sometimes use it. They're collecting gobs of data, and maybe it's okay to have, if you have a big enough data set, if you have some misinterpreted data, some data errors, some bad data in there, that the overall patterns will become true. But it's used with a lot of sort of naivete and not much domain expertise. And I've seen papers that have used data that I'm very familiar with, and like, wow, that's how they use that. I don't agree with it. So I think that more more of a intellectual argument about we need to inject more domain expertise or more domain involvement in what's going on. There's really this parse system where you had the place-based scientists, the empiricists doing stuff, and then the modelers and the data scientists, the data synthesis folks doing something different. How do we get past that? Yeah, question.
Let me focus on that one because that one is tricky, speaking as a modeler, because it sounds like the kind of data you're talking about is highly place-based, contextual, and so on. In contrast to, I'm thinking FIA, which is
lovely.
It has a ton of data, actually too much, arguably, but it's at least put into columns, a lot of which are empty. But at least it's structured. Whereas what you're describing is extremely heterogeneous across data sets.
Yeah.
So what is a reasonable way of using such diverse data set?
Yeah, that's my point of this talk. That's exactly what I'm trying to get to. That's exactly the question. How do we make it easier? How do we make it easier so people can use it? And how do we make sure the domain scientists how do we make sure that it's the best data that you can use? It's the right data. And how do you again invest in making sure that all this idiosyncratic stuff can talk together?
Can you give examples of what such data might be? Like what details you wish to communicate about a forest that is not cleanly shoved into a column?
Yeah. So for example, okay, so some of it is like to get data, and what do you do? Oftentimes it has a very complex, some of these inventories have very complex designs where species of different sizes are put in, are in different, you have different sizes or different plot sizes, and there they need to, so you need to expand them to keep them consistent. And any mistakes across that boundary are really problematic.
Mm-hmm.
And they can sometimes they're pretty complex designs that are that get misinterpreted when they get sucked up going forward. I mean, here's a good example. I want to go to this because this is a good example, because this is 6 sites. These are all, if you see right there, here's Blodgett. Jessica did this study, this is part of her dissertation. These are 6 mechanical fire, mech plus fire sites in California. A lot of these people, Tea Kettle and Blodgett, very similar studies. Sequoia and Blodgett were part of the same initial experiment. These are all places where there's a lot of the same collaborators, a lot of the same protocols. Still, the data got collected at different times and in different ways. And for Jessica to use this data, I got involved in this to help her flush through and clean up all the data. But then after cleaning up all the data, it was also, she didn't just want to do a meta-analysis where she just takes results and takes the reported variance and lobs them together. She wanted to go and analyze the raw data. And to make all of this stuff match together, she had to use a hierarchical Bayesian hierarchical state space model, and then did a sort of a fixed effects model meta regression afterwards to figure it out. It was a huge undertaking. It took her, the data cleaning alone, along with this advanced analysis, just to make these things fit together so she can get numbers that look like this. So this is, this is results on tree growth for controls, burn thin and burn thin interaction with these different, for the different species out there. And the real value here is that one of these is Blodgett. So we have this for 1 site, but Jessica went through and now has them for 7 sites in the Sierra Nevada. So you begin to sort of get a better sense and more confidence in what the response is to these treatments. With all the variability and how the treatments were applied, that's there. But my point is it should not be a PhD level research project, a major part of our dissertation, to both clean the data and figure out a way of dealing with all of the complexity in the data and the way it's reported. It should be easier than that. And partly it's how we inventory folks work, and how that data, and again, how the people who use our data work as well. And I think the big thing that keeps coming up, you see, Greg, you asked me what you think the problems are, and I really think inconsistency is obviously is the biggest obstacle. That they're not consistent in how the data is recorded, and importantly, they're not consistent in how the data is analyzed. And a lot of times, I will take derived part. Like oftentimes you'll see, for example, density numbers or fuel load numbers. Well, those fuel load numbers are based on data, and then sometimes they're derived data, and they never see the original data. And how they got to that point is not just a straightforward sort of summing or a straightforward mean. There's another process, an analytical process on top of that going forward, and those tend to be very opaque. So here's an example. So I'm going to start. The criticisms start with what I'm very involved in. This is our Berkeley Forest inventory system. The inventory was designed in 1973. In 1985, the cutting-edge workflow was this Visual Basic program that was in Access. And you can see this little main switchboard, and you can go and use it, and it still exists today. But if you ask me, I can give you the Blodgett data. If you ask me for some of the Blodgett sort of, an inventory report or a basal area or volume or anything that you really want, we have an analytical program here. And if you go and, ask me for it and go into this thing now, you basically get, this mistake. It doesn't work. The analysis doesn't work because this is literally 1985, 40-year-old Visual Basic program in Access. It doesn't run in the modern version of Access. They literally keep a version of it running at the forest on an old computer to keep it running so they can keep running this thing. And you're like, why are we doing this? Why is this our way? And in part, it's a lack of investment. The current research manager, she's mid-career, she's super bright. She'd love to be able to change it, but she is so busy doing other things that she can't have resources here be diverted to fixing this. And of course, she's desperately worried that someday this thing is not going to work anymore. But right now, they kind of have a very kludge system going forward. And this is Berkeley. This is this is Berkeley Forest inventory sites. Now you think this is okay. So this was built in 1973 and 85. We wouldn't do that now. I'm currently working with CAL FIRE in their California Prescribed Fire Monitoring Program. It's 5 years old, and we're transitioning into the second phase where Berkeley Forest is going to take over take over a lot of the data processing analysis of it. And in the turnover of the data, I was like horrified, to be honest, to realize that this is how they manage their data, and all their analyses are buried in Access queries. So this is for Burton Creek, which is a state park outside. And I just couldn't, I'm like, this is really hard to reproduce. There's reasons for it. One of the reasons for it is that this program is that, although CAL FIRE is doing all the monitoring, the actual burn is done by partners. And the partner here is, on the state parks. Other partners are NGOs. They're not running modern database. They're not running R or Python, or they don't understand. They need a system that they can use, and they know how to use Access, so it's relatively easy to give them something Access. But each one of these queries here is written for each stakeholder, and I'm like, there's no way we're going to do that. But I was just so shocked that this system was designed 2 or 3 years ago, and yet CAL FIRE, which on their firefighting side is extraordinarily embraces technology with some of the best data systems I've seen. Again, when we get to the resource side, we're in 1980s again. So what's the new path forward? This is really where, this is getting back to your question, is that, a colleague of mine, who's here, she's a statistician at Berkeley. She came up with this article in 2020, and, I'm forced to read statistics. I do messy data, so I have to do complicated statistics. I don't really have clean designs. But this was the first time that and she calls it vertical data science. Vertical means truthworthy. This is how, in her paper, how she described it, where this is reality. These are measurements. These are things we observed. And then, oftentimes these observations go into models, or they go into syntheses, statistical synthesis. And they describe this PCS documentation. This is sort of the 3 steps. It's predictability, computability, and from my mind, really important, the stability of the data processing and the data analysis. If I've always had this motto, again, going through some of these projects, my own projects in my own lab, I've seen even papers that I've been on where Results reported from the 2001 inventories at Blodgett are now different in 2009. And I'm like, well, the data didn't change. Why are the results different? And it was 2 different grad student projects. They made different decisions along the way on what to include, what not to include. You do a long-term project, there's all kinds of events come in. We've lost some plots going forward. So you include those plots. So, 2001 has 20 plots per treatment, but by the time you get to 2020, you only have 13 in one of the sites. Like, how do you deal with the fact that you have 20 to 13? How do you deal with that? And there's different sort of justifiable ways, but they're not always well documented. They're not even in the data. They're in the analysis. And so this is this paper that Ben came out with, and it really sort of started changing my thinking about it. And in particular, this is the follow-on textbook that she wrote, is that in this pathway of stability, this is the first time I saw what I would call data cleaning, what you do with the data and how you process the data being sort of built into this stability framework. That this is actually explicitly noted. And a colleague at a seminar I went to on vertical data science, this trustworthy framework, Steve Goodman he's a health statistician at Stanford, really liked this, but he said in this data cleaning, there should also be in here the experimental design. And putting those 2 together, data cleaning and experimental design, then you can build these stability pathways. And the question is, how do we get this? So finally, I'm like, oh, this is what we need to build that in here. How do we do that? So this is what I've been working on, and we have a sort of a pilot going forward. Is the idea is that we need to get scientists and sometimes forest managers who are collecting data for their own purposes. They've designed a study that fits their purposes. That's great. That's great, right? How do we? But they do it. They have their own processes. Oftentimes, they're old processes, but they make it really hard for anybody. Not even if they share the data, it makes it hard for people to reproduce their analyses, right? And so, one idea is to go in there and rebuild it for them. But at the same time, if you go in there and say, "Here, I'm gonna go and make you a whole new system. Here's your Python code. Here's R," they can't maintain it. They can't sort of keep it up. So really, you have to come back with this consortium model where you have a whole bunch of people working together, developing best practices for handling, for data cleaning. These data cleaning questions are very common. You'll see things like, what do you do with missing data? Like, again, if you're thinking of a sensor network or something, there's usually very well structured protocols for what you do with missing data. When weather stations, for example, when you're missing data on a weather because a sensor went down, there's all kinds of really well documented protocols for how you either backfill or not into that. With inventory data, there isn't. It's very ad hoc. Because it's they're individualized. So we need to kind of get trying to bring these folks together. The other part is that oftentimes what I think there are people focus on the protocol, they focus on getting the raw data and on the clean data results, and then the information. The emphasis has always been on the products. And that's important. But if you're thinking about reusing data and you're thinking about taking small data and making it into big data effect insights, you also have to really take into account the design. You have to think about how you measure it. You have to think what kind of cleaning, so you fix, what kind of cleaning you do. And I think most importantly, how you do computing. Like how do you analyze this stuff? And how do you compute it? And then how do you take and summarize it to get meaning applied? And so the goal here is that we're working with a consortium of sort of guinea pigs in my mind. It has state demonstration forests, the experimental forests, it has U.S. Forest Service, and we're working with the forest managers or the applied scientists working for that to see how can we make it easier, what works, what doesn't work, where is the common ground, and how we get these things standardized, and also think how do we maintain it. And I think I'm increasingly think the way we maintain this is by sharing and working together and not staying in these silos, but then they have to be incentivized, and that's by adding value. If we can make it easier, I'm talking to Ariel Ruffin, who's manages Blodgett Forest. She says, if this makes my job easier and it provides the information I need, I am all on board with sharing both the data and the processes. I just don't have the bandwidth to, have a different system. So it needs to be a system that I can use and meets my things going forward. So this is what I'm working on. I mean, I must admit I was a little bit, bringing this to Google, where you guys think about this all the time. It's domain scientists like me trying to figure out what works for domain colleagues like me, applying some of these basic principles of data science, but trying to adjust them so they work at a much sort of more sort of granular level. So thanks for listening, and I'll sort of stop sharing and sort of happy to take any questions.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I think you're describing a very standard and challenging problem that seems to appear in a lot of like heavily distributed communities. In fact, before I get into solutions, you talked about it's like mostly American kind of high analysis force. What about international ones? I'm thinking a lot of the world where you care about forests, they don't have the money to conduct these surveys and run experimental forests. How does it apply there?
Right. Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, again, there's some good, a lot of these inventories are labors of love, right? They're either a forest manager or a community is invested in understanding what's going on. And that's true in North America, that's true in Europe, and it's also true in a lot of the international communities in the tropical forest. And again, part of it is giving tools, and there's some efforts ongoing, particularly in the tropics, because they're so important to, again, provide the sort of information infrastructure and that analytics that people can apply and help. And you see that there's a global tree network that's going on, and there's some more organized ones, the big forest dynamics plots. But again, those are scientists doing it and coordinating it. These are local communities where we're trying to help. And in some ways, what I'm thinking of doing, if you think about it in North America, even in the United States, even in California, we have all of these sites, and even California at the tech capital of the world to some extent, we are unable to integrate these. So, but you're right. Any kind of solution, we want it to be able to go global. And in part, I think I get back to that question about if forests are so important, we need to be serious about measuring them. That's what we want, because they are incredibly idiosyncratic. Each forest is responding different. So if we're going to come to some bigger understanding, we can look at the theories and stuff, but if we're really going to come onto some functional understanding, and if you think about sort of getting a handle on the wildfire problem, we need to have really good fuel measurements, right? And those fuel measurements are really hard to remotely sense, and so they tend to be measured in the field. How do we get those together so we can do much better risk assessments with wildfire? That's a classic sort of inventory problem with really big, sort of implications. And the same thing with, forest resources around the world. So I think this consortium model can work, but it takes a lot of buy-in, and and in some ways it takes a sort of a devoted effort to share what you're finding and make products that work for as many people as possible. There's always going to be some resistance to what's going on. There's always going to be something, I don't want to get into Python because I can't run Python. I want it in R, or I don't want it in R. I want it in some other crazy database. But I think we're moving to where we can get some common solutions.
Right. So I mean, I think this is the right, I don't know, decade for these kinds of solutions, because I mean, as a software engineer, I know that you just keep writing software, and if you have enough software engineers, you can keep rewriting it every 5 years, and that's what people tend to do. And you often don't have money, then you get stuck in a 1985 VBA. And no fault with that. It's just that was the solution of the programmer at that time.
Right.
But
exactly.
now we do have like all these LLMs that can write new software for a new system based on the same database. I mean, I'll just say plus and minus. The plus is that you can throw the chatbots at any image you have, any database you have, as long as it has a verbal description of the columns and hopefully a paper describing the semantics. And then you can start writing code to rationalize it.
Right. That's like I said,
With help you, it could be wrong.
Right. Well, that's what I want. I mean, that's exactly the idea. That's the goal, right? The idea is that not only do you want that data, but you also want to make sure that you are instructing the AI. Here are our rules for dealing with, missing data. Here are our rules for interpolation. Here are our rules. So we can give the domain expert rule. And then here's when you should toss this. I mean, importantly, here's when you should not. Here's data that is not good enough to use, that's not reliable enough to use. And so I think you have you give them an algorithm, and that algorithm needs to be, in some ways, it's best practice from the consortium. That's what, in some ways, across California. I'm trying to get as many peers as possible to weigh in on some of the details and how you deal with day-to-day inventory problems, because we all solve them independently. And sometimes it just leads to very small errors or small differences that are just annoying to me. But sometimes it leads to big errors, big differences, and that lead to different conclusions if you're not careful. And I have there's a bunch of examples. Again, missing data, how you deal with missing data, especially when you have a difference in the number of plots over time and you're trying to do a trend. That's a very common one. Sometimes a lot of this is done by students who come and go, and therefore it's also important to document. Students are learning, and they tend to make some dumb mistakes that if you're not careful, they get propagated going forward. So.
Right. So then, as an experiment, it sounds like you have like a set of databases. It's not like research. Yeah. It's not actual databases, which is nice, with their own schemas. And the question is, how can you rationalize not even schemas, because there are different experimental conditions.
Totally. Yeah, totally.
You have to be just spatially aware when creating queries for that particular database.
Exactly.
You have to the schema.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, I talk about, again, forgive me, but when I say like, we need to make this data AI ready, and I get people scoffing at me like, no, we need to, because we need to make sure that we're training our models on good data, right? And we need to make them AI. And if you really want that, if you want your site to be learned on, you need to make sure it's AI ready. And we're moving that way, trying to get, again, it's a little bit of an apostle to, which tends to be an older crowd by and large, and tends to be a crowd that's focused on their place. But they also share the same concern about this global concern that the forests they love, as well as forests around the world, are really at risks, and that we really need to measure them better.
Right. And the right model, the way I think of it, is if you imagine you have an infinite number of apprentices, and they will make dumb mistakes. So you have to be very clear, verbally clear, not code clear, verbally clear about what you've done. How do you rationalize across different plot designs, which are not the same? And so you have to use physical measures, and this is the one you should use. If you can be that clear, a computer can follow your instructions.
Exactly. That's the nuts. And then the idea is to collect all the schema, understand how they work, and then go. It's exactly the way of trying to do it. Again, and you're right. Part of this is, my experience has been that it has been seeing students make the same mistakes over and over and over again. And in part, that's how they learn, and that's okay. But at some point, you can't let that mistake get propagated. And I think that has been the problem. We just had a student this summer who redid one of the CAL FIRE prescribed fire burns, and he designed his own, we had the protocol, but he designed his own Excel-based sort of data sheet, and he didn't write it in machine learnable code. And when he came to me, and I said, Nathan, you're going to have to enter all this and re-enter all this stuff. They have no way of parsing this code. Like, I don't know, why did you do it this way? It was an easy entry. It means it was easy to do in the field. I'm like, well, that's great, but you don't have any way of making this. And so he's now trying to figure out how to get it into a machine readable, so I can actually analyze it. So he can actually analyze it. Yeah, but that's like a brand new mistake. He's a master student, made a mistake doing that.
Yeah, of course. And so, I guess the question is, what kinds of instructions can you provide about what is in a given data set? Because by now, it's becoming fairly routine to just download 1,000 papers and extract data from them. It's not easy, but it's becoming something that's normal. You're describing you have many databases which have to become open enough to to read the contents and read the schemas. Like I'm thinking FIA, you have 1,000 pages.
Great. FIA's got a 500-page manual. That's great. Yeah. Like you're not going to, FIA is done consistently across every, reasonably consistently across in its entire footprint. A lot of these data sets also are not, they might be discoverable, but they're not very well documented. Clearly getting them documented is the first step, but then also articulating the schema, again, from a forest manager, to make sure that he describes his or she describes her schema well enough so you can teach it to you can articulate it for a coder or coding effort. It's important. I don't often think that way. Just a lot of this is still, honestly, a lot of it is still Excel based data, kind of analysis that's done just to track what's going on in the forest. And they report out all the time. They report the numbers out. They don't, the data and the schemas, and it's getting better. Clearly, in the publishing world, everything's, I'm a big proponent of open science, and so you get the data and the algorithms, right? And that's super helpful. But still, it's a lot of work to put them together.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to be proactive. So Jessica, She has her paper right now, where that's why it's on top of my mind, is that, she said, this has got to be an easier way of doing this. And I'm like, yes, we need to figure out an easier, so it's not so hard at the end.
Yeah, and that's something that you just keep talking about, and we're running, well, we're past time, but that's something where a lot of the like, I'm thinking we definitely have seen uses, and we've used Gemini to synthesize queries on databases that have, if you give it like FIA, if you give it clear enough semantics, it can do something.
Yeah.
If you have several databases, the challenge becomes rationalizing the statistical assumptions, because like FIA, that's very specific tree soup, because you don't have all the trees, you have strata, and each stratum gets a few
exactly
trees, and you have to know how to turn that into a forest, because there's a continuum assumption going on in FIA, which is a different assumption somewhere else.
Yes, it's strata like that. You sample, and then also different components. You sample trees different from shrubs. You certainly sample surface fuels different from litter and duff. So all of this stuff is built in there, and some of this stuff some of the actual measurements have to get processed. So, for example, we measure the depth of litter and the depth of duff, but we report it as a mass. Well, there's a conversion going on in there that oftentimes, again, isn't clearly, like, how do you convert? There's a transfer function from litter depth to litter mass that can be forest specific, region specific, generalized. Where did that come from? That's not always clear either. And that's kind of the goal, is to try. And we're starting with California, and trying to build out from there. And Cal Fire is on board. They've sort of funded this pilot effort. We're to try and figure out how to do this with again, it's I'm working with a lot of different and I'm working directly with the folks doing the inventory, and they're not all researchers, and that's the other one. You got to reach out to non-researchers.
Yeah, and the one thing that also occurs to me is, in addition to all this, you also can join us with local hydrology, take it from the geologists and the satellite people and the God knows who, if you can just put it in the same database.
Right. Well, the other problem, again, I'll just the other problem is that not a problem, but the other hurdle is that we really do need the expertise from the sort of data engineers, and those typically are more expensive. It's a expertise that's hard for typical inventory for a person to access. And so how do we make that? How do we lower the bar by, engaging the data engineers, the software, the developers, so we get these packages. And then we make sure as many people as possible get that. That's why I love the open, the whole idea of open source stuff. I mean, it's just, I guess sometimes it has its downside, but boy, open source, reproducible code is super valuable, because it can be super. And so I think that's another part, that how do we bring all of these resources, so it not only does it build good, good AI models, but also helps them do their job better. I think that's where it begins. And if we can make it easier for them to do it, it's super expensive. It's not well funded. So how do we maintain that inventory, so that detail level information?
Yeah, it's kept and rationalized, and everybody has motivation to release their data so that they get a benefit back.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, cool. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you for taking the extra time.
No problem. It's fun. I appreciate the invite.